All right, you guys are all good to go whenever.
Great.
Show's yours, Charles.
Fantastic. So, yeah, so picking up, I guess, where we left off. So, I sent an agenda out that was, certainly robust, and in many ways could set the stage, for a number of months to come in terms of the topics that we're gonna, look to focus on and dive deeper into. One thing I didn't really touch on, was the subcommittee structure, but certainly, some of the subcommittees that we have in place, are probably going to want to reconvene independently and come up with action plans and next steps to, kind of further go through a number of these topics. So that's some.
Just one quick thing, you haven't officially opened the meeting.
That's a good point. That's a good point. I'm just picking up where I left off from work, I guess. So yeah, we're not at work. Welcome to the budget committee. Motion to open the meeting.
I'll move. So open the meeting.
Second.
So moved.
Ellen moved, Bill seconded.
Great.
Have to ask for all in favor.
You need to call for a vote, Charles.
All in favor of opening the meeting?
Yes.
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 So sometimes pay too much attention to that ministerial stuff.
Do I need to get my Robert's rules book out? Yeah, so I think there's going to be a lot to talk about for the upcoming year. The subcommittees that we have in place are probably well served to do deep dives and continuing to do deep dives into a number of these topics. But for tonight, if we can touch on them, try to set a structure for the upcoming year, get everybody's feedback, and dive a little bit deeper into some of these. That's kind of what I was envisioning. So with that, recapping the adopted budget and the process for a collective analysis going forward. So Dan, start off as far as a latest and greatest version to distribute. Is that something that you could, or Dan Natchez, if you guys could provide, so we're all looking at the same document electronically? Is that available at this point?
I've been working with Augie. I need to update some of the narratives, organizational charts, things like that. The numbers can be sent out, but it's just a matter of finalizing some of the ancillary information in the budget. So I can go over the highlights, or we call my lowlights of this process, without having to dramatically change it in the course of several weeks.
Yeah, if you want to maybe recap kind of where you and the board left off, and what the next steps are, what we're going to be looking at versus what we had looked at last year, maybe how things might have changed, and some bullets to look for and to expect in the document that we'll be reviewing, and then we as a group can talk about how we want to at least go through that and align ourselves.
So we filed, or the manager filed the tentative budget on March 13th of this year, which is 1 week in advance of the statutory requirement. Once we filed it, then the shutdown hit New York. Between basically March 17, 18, and the budget adoption, we recommended about between budget cuts and revenue readjustments, about $2.5 million change from the reduction from the tentative budget to the adopted budget. Actually, on our website, we have a list of all of the changes that were adopted from the tentative to the approved. A lot of it was, not filling positions that were open. Some pretty drastic cuts in some other areas. So far we've been able to avoid having to furlough or lay off any staff. But, this is something we have to watch like a hawk for the next 12 months, or maybe, more accurately, 9 months at this point, because we'll be in budget season again come January, February of 2021, and we'll have a good foothold on where we are. That's kind of the short and dirty version of how we got to the adopted budget. And I know that there were still, additional items that people were asking us to look at, like our pension payment for this year, some of the other benefits that we offer. There were some things that we had done going into this year, which were going to have very real long-term benefits to us, like renegotiating with CSEA to, really change the salary schedule and the step schedule, so we'll be able to control our costs much more greatly in future years. But we did have a settled contract with them. We had a settled contract with the PBA, so the salaries that were in effect for the bargaining unit positions were already fixed. There's not much we can do with that. We kept a tight rein on the non-union staff who don't have negotiated increases. The non-union staff received 1% increases as of June 1. So that's kind of how we're controlling costs there. We were able to realize some significant reductions through negotiating this year for our workers' comp insurance and our general liability insurance. Saved probably $500,000 between those two items. So, there were a lot of things we did to really attack this budget with a hatchet and a pencil.
Dan, did you say that we've settled with this PBA at this point?
They have a settled contract. They had a settled contract going into for the fiscal year 2021 budget. I think they're settled through next year, but I can confirm that and let everyone know tomorrow.
Thanks, Dan. Would you be able to distribute both the bullets of what changed, or a link to that on the website, if you have a moment for that, so everybody knows that they can find it?
Yeah, I actually might be able to distribute that within Zoom, maybe. If not, I will email it, but just give me 1 second. Let's see if I can.
And then the latest digital copy of the I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go and finish what you're doing, Charles.
Digital copy of the budget, and then we had the two, the longer version that we were distributed the hard copy of. So I guess if both of those are available electronically, and then so you're making some ancillary tweaks subsequent to what is currently available. Is that what you were saying?
Well, not tweaks to the budget, but just I have to tweak some of the written narratives and the organizational charts. It's stuff that is not appendices, but stuff we include in the budget to make it a more provide more public information.
Okay, and not to over question this, but if a budget is adopted, is there that flexibility to change language in, not so much an org chart, but if there's appendices and the like, and how that narrative relates to what was adopted? Is that kosher typically?
I'm sorry, could you repeat that?
Is it acceptable to after a budget is adopted to change language within the written narrative?
Yeah, I mean, that's fine. It's the board adopts appropriations. I mean, the narratives is just English. For instance, when we prepare the tentative budget, we had a different village planner and a different engineer. Our village engineer took a job with Westchester County, and our village planner took a job in Scarsdale, and we just hired a new planner who started yesterday. So it's stuff like that. I just want to have accurate for the document.
Okay. And then with that, and I'll, maybe open this up to the group. So, we had a process leading up to this that we laid out the year with timeframes for what we were looking to accomplish so that we were kind of able to keep ourselves on track, throughout the year. We had subcommittees focusing on different components of the budget. But, beyond that, do you guys have thoughts about, how we want to begin to review what was adopted, understand that document, and then use that information, to understand what we're going to do going forward?
I think if we look at what was adopted this year, a lot of that was based on what was going on with the pandemic. So I'm not sure that that's necessarily the appropriate basis for next year. I mean, time will tell where we are. But I think given that we may want to keep in mind that economically, we're not going to bounce back in such a short window.
If I can, Charles, this is Dan, Dan N. There were some last minute changes, like $350,000 from the operating fund was taken out and put into the capital fund for vehicles. And the committee spent a lot of time trying to come up with a format and policy approach for the capital budget. And meeting with Board of Trustees got canceled, postponed, rescheduled. It never happened due to the pandemic. It would be a shame from my vantage point for us to lose that momentum and those policy approaches. So I think it would be good just maybe one of the first things to concentrate on as a committee is to go back and review where we were in the capital budget and request to meet with the Board of Trustees to go over, capital budget planning and implementation.
So
Strategy.
Dan, no, I'm sorry. I believe that's the document that we had submitted to the Board of Trustees. I know on a couple of the calls I attended, that document was referenced by the Board of Trustees.
It was referenced, but I don't, Dan, you correct me if I'm wrong. I don't think we ever adopted it. We talked around it.
Correct. But what I was going to say is I believe item number 4 on the agenda for tonight is that document. And do we want to make any amendments? So I think that's...
I think it should be updated to the extent that any updates are required.
Yep.
I think, Dan Sarnoff, if you can send out to the committee the updated capital budget as amended through last night.
Okay, so
Or ask Augie to do that, I guess.
well, I think it's basically we just need to insert a couple of extra projects like the swing sets.
Well, but I think the committee needs to have an updated approach to take a look at and look at the implications of what will be happening over the next 5 years. Guys started as opposed to looking at just a list of things. And I think also if you can have Augie send to the committee directly the email he sent out yesterday to the Board of Trustees, an update of where we are ending up last year and where we are in the first month of this year. Okay. Just as background information, it's not, the bottom line is that we appear, based on the numbers from last year, to have actually ended up with $1 million surplus as opposed to be in the red. You got to look at it, but that's their bottom line. I don't think the Board of Trustees totally has a handle on the capital budget. And from the discussions that we've been having ongoing through last night, it's my assessment that your input would be helpful, not in determining what projects get approved, but how to approve projects.
I think that that's a great point that, you know, a lot went into that document. It's great that it's being referenced, it getting you know, us doing an updated review, making whatever changes we think are appropriate, getting it adopted. And to your point, Dan, you know, we were, I think, even scheduled to have the meeting with the board to review the document. And that didn't happen for a variety of reasons. So us getting that on the calendar for this, you know, the first, you know, few months of this year would be valuable.
Well, I think it would be helpful because we get all sorts of requests, and there's no such thing as a budget request that is frivolous from the people who are making that request. And so then the question is prioritizing, and that's something that he has been stressing from you know, from day one, and I think that that's a very important thing to drive home.
It is, and Ellen, just to continue with your point, you know, obviously, you know, the effort was put forth kind of under the gun with COVID and having to make assumptions with respect to how to adopt a budget in that context. But now we know more, and then there's more information, things have changed. So I guess it could go in either direction, that we would be reevaluating with new information that we have, looking at the assumptions that were made at the time, and kind of starting fresh from, you know, what needs to kind of be
But the reason why I brought that up, so when we were last able to meet as a committee, which I think was February, the world was very different. So what we have been reviewing with Augie in terms of our year-to-date revenues, year-to-date expenses versus the budget really got thrown out the window when the pandemic hit. So I'm not sure which pieces, or all of it, you know, put together, we should be leveraging for what we want to do going forward. Because we don't know what's going to happen with the economy. We don't know how quickly things are going to change.
Absolutely. And maybe skipping over bullet 2, which was, you know, kind of recapping the prior year and what worked and what didn't. You know, the third bullet was the revenue analysis, trend across pandemic to date and assumptions regarding forward projections, which kind of relates to what you're talking about. And that revenue analysis is critical. Thank you, Dan, for providing the information that you did. That's, you know, obviously disturbing that you're at 40% reductions in other counties. I guess comparatively 20% for Westchester is a good thing, but still somewhat alarming. And then the last piece that you, and I think in your email about the 1%.
Yeah, I think the reason why it's a roughly 20% reduction as opposed to a 40% reduction, which you're seeing statewide, that may be more attributable to the 1% increase in the sales tax that was approved last year, because that didn't go into effect on day 1 of its approval. I think it went into effect on June 1 or July 1. So there's some variables within that, but you know, for you know, just for looking at it in this perspective, you know, we are going to be it looks like we're going to be, if not ahead, but maybe online with what we've seen in prior years, or you know, when we adopted our budget for the 1920 fiscal year, the sales tax had not been approved, so that was not reflected in what was adopted. So we did very well in 1920 on our sales tax revenue. My guess is in the next report, you'll probably see a closer to that, you know, 20 to 40% reduction in the year-to-year comparison.
And 1% would be if it was 6 or whatever it was. If you take, 6 to 7, that's a 16% increase. So it was a full 1%, which is whatever, 15, 20%. And that in turn offset.
Yeah, and as you saw, I think just for our region, it was around 35% for most communities. Throughout the state, it would vary between 35 to 40% decrease year to year.
Okay. And is there any feedback on property tax revenue being impacted? Yeah, I guess we're going to find out.
No, we have our report for the first half collection. So just to put in context, last year for 1920, we collected 95%. This year we collected 96%.
Oh,
That's interesting.
and what was the collection date again?
It was the bills went out June 1, so they were due by June 30.
Wow, that's
Or
fantastic.
July 1st, yeah. But we actually had slightly, and I'm not counting it. It's approximately the same collection rate year to year.
Wow,
I'm not.
interesting.
What's 1% among friends?
Interesting. Okay, well that's encouraging as well. But if you're anticipating that
I mean, it's hard to anticipate what we'll see in second half. But the fact is, a majority of residents are probably paying it through their escrow through their mortgage, and that the bank has to remit the entire tax bill. So, we know that irrespective of anything else, people who have mortgages and pay their property tax through mortgages, we're going to collect 100% of that.
yeah, I mean, there's more. It probably would have already. You would have seen this, but there is mortgage relief out there right now,
Yeah.
where there's 6-month deferments in play with the possibility of extensions. And I think the language reads with those deferments that you can also defer the taxes, but then you're subjecting yourself obviously to, the liens and the like. But I think the mortgage companies are giving you the flexibility they're not leaning on you directly for the escrow component.
Yeah, but regardless,
96 is 96.
yeah.
All right, well, that's cool. But, if we're at 20 and we're project, so this is part of the work maybe going forward is that, we'll look at the next quarter and is it still at 20? What is that going to mean? If it's gone up to 40, then what? And all that good stuff. But that's going to be a lot of work for
Yeah, I mean,
the revenue analysis going forward.
We've been looking at the sales tax revenue since April. And, that was when the pandemic hit, the county took it upon themselves to try and help the municipalities identify what we could be looking at as far as sales tax shortfalls. And what they did is they looked at the last time there was a major decrease, which was the economic downturn in 2009. I think for the first, they said that the first quarter was about a 20% decrease. There's a 20% in the second quarter, and I'm going what our quarters are. So for the June, July, August, back in 2009, it was 20% reduction, another 20% in September, October, November. But then it would start getting better, a 10% reduction, then a 10% reduction, but then it kind of just got back to normal at some point. Obviously, it's a totally different set of circumstances that we're experiencing in 2020 as opposed to the last time we had a major recession. But the county was anticipating, and they were saying, we expect to realize full sales tax revenue probably towards January, February of 2021. We were pretty conservative. I think in between the tentative budget and the adopted budget, we cut it by about 25% that revenue. The feeling was whatever we budgeted for our current budget at the time, which was 1920 budget, is what we should think about budgeting for 2021. And in last year, I think we budgeted just shy of 3.1 million. So we I think we're kind of in that area again for this year.
So wait, I'm sorry, the last piece was pretty important. You're suggesting that, so what was budgeted?
For in 1920, the 1920 budget, we budgeted, I think, just shy of 3.1 million. And they kind of said, whatever you budgeted for, what they said to the villages, because, you know, when this hit, we were all doing our budgets. They said, they kind of said, whatever you budgeted in 1920, that's what you should look at for this year. And our sales tax estimate for this year is, I believe, in line with what we budgeted last year. Not what we received this year, but what we budgeted. So that 3.1 million, give or take.
All right, so that's a loaded, thank you. And that's a loaded topic and a loaded analysis that we'll probably want to get into going forward.
Yeah.
Did anyone else have anything they wanted to add on that for the time being, other than there being a lot to watch, a lot to hope for, and probably a lot to analyze?
I mean, there are also several other differences between now and 2009, mostly that, you know, we collect revenue for online sales now, as opposed to 10 years ago, which that was not a thing.
Interesting. Okay. So I guess briefly, so recapping the prior year, what worked, what can we do better and differently? Some ideas are that, you know, we laid out the year with a schedule. I think we tried to really hold to that. We structured subcommittees. I think the subcommittees produced really good work. So I would probably suggest continuing with that process. As far as what do you guys want to add to what we could do better, differently, more of, less of?
The only thing I'll add is once we started doing meetings with the board after the pandemic hit, there was very little participation from this committee. And, you know, it put, and Ed, I'm gonna now put words in your mouth, so I apologize, but it kind of put us in a position of talking for the budget committee without having the benefit of speaking with the budget committee.
Yeah, that's a great point. And so obviously it's a new environment, you know, if to some degree participation with board meetings, both ours and the Board of Trustees, could be looked at as being more accessible with this platform. And, you know, at the same time, the Board of Trustees sessions that just concluded, there are a lot of them. You know, maybe we need to schedule it and kind of divide and conquer that and make sure we have, you know, representation and really try to get volunteers and schedule it and see that we can have people, you know, representing us and it being a bit more collective going forward.
Well, I think one of the challenges with that, though, was we weren't allowed to meet. So
Right.
even though it was fine, you know, that I was able to attend all the meetings, I couldn't speak on behalf of the committee because we weren't allowed to meet separately. So if that situation ever exists again, more people need to participate in the work sessions. That's all I was saying.
I got you. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
I think we should argue that we should be allowed to meet.
Well, the answer is that everybody's being allowed to meet now.
Yep.
Not going to get into why the decisions were made that were where they were, but you know, it is where we are. But Charles, one of the things I think would be helpful if we have a topic such as the capital budget, et cetera, that the committee really wants to talk to the board about, we should be requesting time at a work session. When I say time, not a couple of minutes, I'm talking about a half an hour or if necessary more, to walk through things. And that gets scheduled and then everybody is allowed to join as a participant as opposed to, you know, having to raise their hand, et cetera.
Noted. Yep, makes sense. Did anybody else want to add anything about, what they thought worked this year, what we continue with, what we don't, what we could do differently?
No, I agree with you. We were on a great roll until the world kind of fell apart,
Agreed.
all out of our control.
Mm-hmm.
Actually out of everybody's control, almost.
No.
The board didn't like what happened either.
I wasn't making it a budget committee control issue. I meant a general global our control.
Well, I concur.
And I think we had some nice accomplishments. We started off at the beginning with a relook at the mission statement. We all shouldered up and collectively came up with language that we liked for the mission statement. We established subcommittees. We stuck to a schedule. We built a capital budget framework. We had the procurement policy that we rewrote. We did a revenue analysis. There was the waterworks efforts. I mean, quite a lot. And now that frameworks are in place, we can move forward, get more into the weeds, focus on specific issues, keep the momentum going, or pick the momentum back up that we had and keep it going. So, to be continued. 4 was the capital budget expenditures for the current year, revisiting the frameworks. So we talked about revisiting the framework.
And I'm the I'm the one who asked that we include that on the agenda. So you all saw the 9 million emails back and forth last week between Tom and me. I did speak with Tom, let him know my comments were my comments, not the budget committee. I also told him that when I asked that the decision on the fire engine be deferred until we meet, it wasn't to make a recommendation on the fire engine. It was because we hadn't been able to meet due to the pandemic to really finish going through the capital plan. So he said he got it and he thought he jumped too quickly in his response to me, but I want you all to know, I smoothed it over with Tom and made sure he knew none of this came from you guys. It was all me on my emails. But during all of that, and you're all copied on the responses from Augie on the debt service, I was on the phone with Augie because I wanted to make sure I comprehended what he said correctly. So this year, for the 2020-2021 budget, we have approximately 3.7 million in debt service in the plan. That 3.7 million covers the existing bonds. It does not include any additional capital expenditures. So Dan Sarnoff,
Yeah.
You might be able to answer this question. Do we only go out for bonds once a year at the end of the year?
It depends. We're actually looking to, we're trying to put together a bond issue in the short term right now. I met with Augie this morning to look at our capital project length schedule, what can be closed and put out to bid or put out to bond. So we're looking to possibly do something in the next couple of months to do a call for a bond issue.
Okay, so if we issue, thank you. If we issue a new bond, the service on that bond, if there are any payments that are due before the next budget cycle, aren't included.
Yeah, but
So-
okay, go ahead.
He said the 3.7 covers existing bonds only.
Yep.
There's no existing debt service. So if we bring on new debt and we have to make any payments, we're over plan in the debt service category. So
Okay, go ahead.
I'm not here to argue about the budget, if it's right,
Yeah.
if it's wrong. So what I think we need to include in our capital framework document, so and I don't have it in front of me, but there's a part that I think we reference keeping the debt service to, I want to say 7.5% of the total plan, and to make sure we stay within the total cap. I would say as much leeway as we have to stay within that 7.5%, we should budget additional funds for new payments if things are not dropping off. So what Augie told me was that 3.7 million was what we would have to pay over the next 12 months. So there isn't stuff dropping off with the gap that you could then fill in to keep us at the 3.7. So I think our recommendation should include, and I'm probably not explaining it clearly, so I apologize, but a bullet to say that we cover that. Otherwise, we're always going to have a budget shortfall in this.
No, I understand. I think you want to make sure that we're managing our debt service and our debt service payments in such a manner that we try to avoid adding stuff to the schedule before other stuff falls off.
No, what I'm really trying to say is let's make sure we have payments in the budget.
Yeah.
So
Okay.
so Jerry and all the department heads, and you were probably involved, Augie was involved, spent a lot of time getting 5-year capital plan info. That doesn't mean the board's approving all these acquisitions, but let's pretend they did. If we know what we're acquiring over the next 12 months, we should be able to plan debt service to cover that.
Yeah, and ultimately,
And we don't.
but with the capital budget, ultimately, unless there is a pre-existing appropriation from the Board of Trustees, anything in there that requires going out to debt or awarding a contract has to go to the board for approval. So the board does approve items in the capital budget as we move along. So
I'm not saying the board doesn't approve it.
okay,
I'm saying we have X amount of money in the budget to cover our debt service.
absolutely.
All right, so now I'm going to approve a new bond for 5 million. The board approves that. We don't have the debt service for that 5 million in the plan.
Okay, so
That's the gap I'm trying to close.
okay, and I think
But it gets a little bit more important, not only to close the gap, but to have a framework of how much debt service should we be
Yep.
having, and if we go over that, is that a yellow light or a red light that starts flashing?
so. It's kind of when we're presenting something to the board for approval, we should demonstrate or somehow show the fiscal impact.
Absolutely. So Augie had sent out,
Ellen?
and it sounds like I'm harping on the fire engine, which I'm not, but Augie sent out the debt service, which Dan, I believe, Dan N. forwarded to the budget committee for the new fire engine, and it's approximately $55,000 a year. That $55,000 is not budgeted,
Okay, I understand that.
even though we knew they wanted a new fire engine this year.
What is the timing typically of the bond issuance? Because I think I touched on it briefly with Jerry, and Augie started to talk a little bit about it, and it's something I'd like to learn more about in the upcoming year. But
Yeah.
my understanding was that the timing of the issuance of the debt was structured to coincide with it being retired to avoid this. And how typical is it to do an interim bond issuance, or are they typically structured at the same time of the year to concur with retiring debt?
Yeah, I think Augie will probably be more able to address that, and I can ask him to work on addressing that question.
Cool.
That would be great.
Yeah, it's kind of about the philosophy and practice of how you structure your debt.
So the other interesting thing Augie mentioned, and I hope he doesn't mind that I'm saying he mentioned this because I think it's an excellent idea. So I'm giving him credit for a good idea. I don't want to steal it from him. If for some reason. So early on when we were talking to him about debt, he said in general, we can absorb between 7 and 8 million a year and stay at that 7.5% debt service level against the total budget. So Fantasyland, let's pretend 1 year's capital asks are only 5 million. We have 3 million extra. He thinks we should still plan for that and start building up a capital reserve,
Yeah, I mean,
which we don't do because the next year, you know, we may need 20 million.
yeah, I mean, Leon Potok, when he was a trustee, asked, you know, if you had more money, could you spend more? I told him we can spend as much as you give us. There's never a lack of work to be done, and you know, being in a position to implement necessary capital improvements, and I would as a administrator, I'm very much in favor of that. But again, that comes down to a philosophy and of budgeting and fiscal policy.
Right, and if you look at the list over the 5 years, even ignoring the Army Corps project, because that's a whole beast in itself, there are a lot of very serious things in there, like the seawalls, the sewer lines. I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff that we really have to do.
Yeah.
So if there's any year we could start building towards those bigger expenses, I think we should.
You are not going to get an argument from me on that.
So
I just think so.
these are things that need to be, thrashed out and put and synthesized so that you can present it to the board as, these are the types of questions that you need to focus on, and here are approaches that are suggested you may wish to use.
Yep.
Charles, you're on mute. Charles, you're on mute. You're on mute. There you go.
Thank you. Not sure how that happened. Yeah, so that could be something to revisit with the capital budget framework recommendations and having language in there, better understanding that process, and then from there.
So Dan Natchez, can I ask you a question?
No.
Please. To go back to the fire engine, was that approved yesterday?
It was approved last night.
Okay.
Yeah, and I did listen to the link that was sent, and just to reiterate, I think Victor's point that it being thematic, that identifying priorities is critical in general, I think is something that we all continue to just keep in front of us.
And I don't think it should be who gets to the board first.
Right.
And the fire truck was one of the largest single asks. But if you look at the list for this year, there's a bunch at 350, 450, 650 that to me seem much more critical. And one state mandated, the Hunter whatever parking lot.
And was, because I didn't hear it in the link that was sent, but was there an analysis done as to the condition of the existing truck that this was replacing and how critical? And they did do that analysis.
Yeah.
And
that was in a previous work session.
Gotcha.
Part of it also includes the fact that by moving the current truck into a support capacity spare, it'll allow us to get rid of the current spare, which is, I think that's 35, 40 years old at this point. It's really seen its last days. So it accomplishes several options, several goals.
Okay, and I wanted to thank you, and I wanted to just, as an example, use the work that Ellen, put into that analysis, and work that she, quite frankly, has done on prior analysis within the similar arena, which was to get the data, to do the fact finding, to synthesize it, to get that information in front of everybody and then be able to make decisions with that information. And, that's really the process. And I really appreciate that. And
Thank you. But in reality, that analysis on the fire departments was done on behalf of Dan Sarnoff and Augie for the pension.
Yep.
It had nothing to do with the fire engine.
right.
It just other information came out. So
it did.
Yep.
Which is probably a good sequitur into the last topic, which I just felt obligated with the attention that this topic has been getting, with our being copied on more emails than I could count. I don't like the term defunding. I think that's misleading. But there are requests and recommendations. It's a hot topic. I don't know what we do with that, but I just want to go back to the theme of priorities, of having facts, doing information gathering, and that would be my thought about this last topic.
So this is going to sound really obnoxious, and so I apologize in advance. But to me, it almost seemed like a bunch of school kids got an assignment. It was the exact same email.
Yep.
We got emails from residents of Larchmont asking us to as a constituent of your village. So I'm not sure how much they were particularly behind that. But I did have a conversation with the neighbor's college kid who also was all over this defunding. And it was a very interesting conversation because he said, we're in one of the wealthiest counties in the country. Why do we need police?
Well,
yeah, exactly. And one of his friends is the reason why I needed the police one time, which I politely reminded him as his drunk friend was trying to break into my house. But I think, and I agree with you, the term defund is the wrong term. But I actually said to him, we do need the police. Even if it's just you're in a car accident, you're not going to get an insurance payment without a police report. So you need to look at policies in place. But I said to him, do me a favor and go pull some crime statistics for the village of Mamaroneck and then come back and let's have a chat. And that ended the whole conversation. That was 3.5 weeks ago. I'm still waiting for the statistics.
One other thing about this issue, though, I know the emails, many of them were form emails, but under the governor's plan on policing, every community in the state has to have a conversation with amongst the community and the police and the budget people as to how the police are going to be working in the future. And if you don't do that, you're not going to get state funding. So we don't have to say it's because of these emails, but I think the village has got to address this issue. But in general, we're really an advisory committee for the board. And if the board thinks we can be helpful on this issue, we can either ask them if they want us to help or wait for them to ask us to help. I'm not on the board for more than since January, so I don't know what the normal practice would be. But those are the two things. We can't ignore this because now the governor is making it an obligation for us.
So Dan, has the board talked about that at all?
Not in terms of the in specifics. I think we're still trying to find our way. I think your any help that you can suggest would be welcome.
To kind of buttress what Trustee Natchez just said. On a quarterly basis, we have a meeting among the town, the village of Larchmont, and the school districts. And, participating today were Mayor Walsh from Larchmont, Supervisor Seligson from the town of Amerenik, and we're kind of all in the same situation as Dan just alluded to. That's kind of where we're at this point.
So I think, Charles, you may want to add it to the list, and if you want confirmation, just send a request to the mayor and the board, that this is one of the topics that has arisen. Would you like us to work on it or something like that if you want?
Yeah, I think it's to Ed's point, if there's been a mandate, and this sort of relates to what I was raising about, the work that Ellen did, is, I have really no facts about how to make an argument one way or another with respect to this. I don't know if you guys have time for that. And to Ed's point, if it's something that you think needs to be answered and you guys could use assistance with doing an analysis, we're here. I don't know how the rest of the group feels about, I would probably err on the side of caution of raising this, but maybe it's something that we can talk about, as we go forward in terms of identifying our priorities for the year, in terms of what analysis we want to do, and whether we start to touch on this.
I have the time, but I would rather wait for the board to tell us what they would like done.
We have a managers group, and we meet the third Wednesday of every month. So our meeting is scheduled for tomorrow. I think this is one of the topics on the agenda to see where we all are with this. And I can, assuming we get to it, I can report to the board on that.
Yeah, and to just reiterate, the objective is to be objective. And, if we can provide an, objective data and assistance, that's what we're here for.
So what I would suggest, Charles, if it can provide the actual language that is the mandate and put it in that and say this is what is now required. Would you like us to try and antiseptically try and get a handle on this or something like that and send it to me? I will bring it to the board.
Yeah, I'm very reluctant to raise it, if you will.
Okay, that's fine.
I think I'd rather you guys come to us if you feel like you need our assistance with it. It's just it's a really sensitive one, and we're here if you need us.
And I'd like the ask of us to be specific, not just do some analysis.
Ed, do you have the actual language from the governors that you can?
I just was reflecting on the what he said when he adopted it. He sounded like he was requiring communities to really have a discussion amongst the politicians and the community people as to how we're going to not defund police but reform police.
Yeah, I think everything's laid out in one of the governor's executive orders.
Dan, if you can find that and send that to me, I'd appreciate it. I'll raise it with the board.
Yep. Actually, do you want it? I can email you the link right now, or I can post it here in Zoom, whatever's easier.
Send it to by email. Do not send it by Zoom.
Okay.
I'm delighted that I can press a button and get on.
So I'm going to use my personal email.
Don't push your luck.
Okay, then I will. You'll have it in about 1 minute.
That long?
Yeah, I have to send it from one email to the other, and I'll send it to you.
Okay, thank you.
You got it.
Okay.
Yeah. If there wasn't anything else, and those were really our topiks for the evening, I would make a motion to adjourn unless anybody else has anything else they'd want to discuss.
Yeah, I just want to recap, Dan, that you're going to have Augie send the updated budget figures to the committee.
Yep.
his analysis of where we ended up the last year and the first month of this year to the committee.
Okay, yeah, I'll do that. Did you send the committee the email from Augie's email, Dan, or not?
I did not send. I have not had time to get to that. To do
Okay,
that.
I can forward that. We can give you information on first month revenues. I don't know if there's going to be a lot of utility at this point for what the numbers show, but we can certainly get that to you.
Whatever we can give the committee to, to update them to be as current as possible, I think is important.
Yep.
And what happened, with, what got put into the capital expenditures and update that portion of the budget. And then you have, Charles, then I think you have some hard data to try and, get into.
Great.
Okay. So I didn't mean to delay the meeting, but I wanted to make sure that we were clear on what had to get forwarded to you.
Fantastic. Anybody have anything else? Okay, motion to adjourn.
I'll move to adjourn.
Second.
And revising it.
I'm sorry, Alan, what was that?
On the capital framework
Mm-hmm.
document that we already submitted to the board, are we revising that and resubmitting it, or are we waiting until we talk to the board?
I would
With what
revise
we-
it. I would revise it and resubmit it. Otherwise, we're going to go around in circles.
Okay, so I only had the PDF version that was sent out. Do you have the initial version in Word, Charles?
If it was distributed, I had it. And
If you have it in Word, if you want to send it to me, I'll put in the couple of bullets that I think need to be added and send it out to the committee to take a look at.
great.
Make sure we're all in sync.
Sounds good.
All right.
You need a vote to adjourn.
Motion to adjourn.
No, you need a vote on it. You had a motion. You
All
need
those
a
in
vote.
favor to adjourn?
In favor?
Aye. I'll get with these procedures. I need to refresh, but
Anyway, thank you all for your time and your dedication and the effort that you put into this. I think it's very admirable.
Thank you, guys. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks, guys.
thanks.
All right.
Talk soon. Ciao.
Have a good night.
Bye
Good
now.
night.
All right, everybody.